are live.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining. I see folks are joining rapidly right now. We will give everyone a few minutes to come in. It's great to see so many people joining. My name is Ben Cushing with the Sierra Club, and we're really grateful that you're joining us today for this Stop the Money Pipeline training and webinar. We will get started in just a few minutes, just a couple minutes. While you are joining, if you're joining by Zoom or Facebook Live, feel free to drop your name and location in the chat so we can see who's joining and where people are coming from. And there will be a recording of the webinar shared afterwards. Great to see so many people joining from all over the place. Again, my name is Ben Cushing. I'm with the Sierra Club. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I still see a lot of people joining, so we're going to give folks just another minute here. If you're just joining us via Zoom or Facebook, feel free to drop your name and location in the chat, and we can see where folks are joining from. We've got people joining from all across the country today, which is really exciting, all across the world. So please drop your name and location in the chat. All right. See the numbers climbing a bit. Give folks just a few more seconds here and then we will get started. Thank you everyone who's putting your name and location in the chat. It's great to see people joining from all across the US and across the world today. Get started in just a second here. Okay, well, we've got a lot of folks on here, so I think we're going to dive right in and get to our panel. So again, my name is Ben Cushing. I am a campaigner with the Sierra Club based in Washington, D.C. And I'm really excited and grateful to see so many people joining today. I want to thank the Stop the Money Pipeline Coalition for hosting this webinar today. For those of you who don't know, Stop the Money Pipeline is a broad-based, people-powered movement of more than 90 organizations working to stop the financial industry from fueling the climate crisis. Many of you joining today may have attended Stop the Money Pipeline's Finance 101 training on how banks, asset managers, and insurers are supporting fossil fuels. In this webinar, we'll be diving into banks in particular. And you're going to hear from people doing finance campaigning work in a variety of different ways, all making the connections between big banks and the climate crisis. First up, we're going to have Allison Kirsch from Rainforest Action Network, who will set the stage on how banks are worsening the climate crisis. Then Ernst-Jan Kuiper from Banktrack, an organization based in the Netherlands, will give more detail on the best and worst players across banks all over the world. Then we'll hear from Dallas Goldtooth from Indigenous Environmental Network to talk about how banks and bank campaign strategies are used successfully in frontline campaign fights. And then finally, we will hear from Rachel Heaton from Maziska Talks, who will give an example of how this work continues to play out on the ground in frontline fights. So a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions, please put those into the chat, whether you are joining us by Zoom or Facebook, and we'll be monitoring the questions as they come in today, and we will leave some time at the end for Q&A. If you have not already, please feel free to drop your name and location in the chat so we can see who all is joining us today. And keep an eye out for poll questions throughout the webinar today. We're going to hear from several different speakers, and interspersed, we're going to have a number of questions to engage you all and hear what you think about these topics and how you are looking to get engaged. So keep an eye out for those poll questions, and you can answer those questions when they pop up. So I think that's about all the housekeeping that we have for now. We're actually going to go to our first poll question before we jump into Allison's presentation. So the first poll question that should be popped up on your screen now is, which of these banks do you think funds the most fossil fuels? The options are Bank of America, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, or Citi. Again, the question you should see on your screen now is, which of these banks do you think funds the most fossil fuels? Bank of America, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, or Citi? Feel free to vote. Just go with your gut, and we will we'll close that out in just a second here. For folks who are just seeing the poll now, which of these banks do you think funds the most fossil fuels? Bank of America, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, and Citi. All right, I think we'll see the results now. Okay, a lot of you aren't new here, it turns out, and have done your homework a little bit. So about 75% of you said JP Morgan Chase, which is correct. JP Morgan Chase is the largest fossil fuel funder in the world by far. But it is important to note that these four banks are the four largest fossil fuel funders in the world, and they are all headquartered in the United States. So those of you who are joining us in the US, we have a unique responsibility and opportunity to hold JP Morgan Chase and all four of these major US banks accountable on climate change. So to hear more about that and how banks are driving the climate crisis, first up, we're going to hear from Allison Kirsch from the Rainforest Action Network.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. And thank you everyone so much for joining, for polling. It is great to be here with you all. So as Ben said, I'm going to talk about how banks drive the climate crisis and the extent to which that is happening. So I'm going to start off getting a teeny bit technical. For those of you who are on that Finance 101 webinar that Ben mentioned, you heard about how the financial sector overall supports the fossil fuel industry, excuse me. So that's banks, that's insurers, and that's asset managers. We're focusing in on banks today, but even banks have many, many ways that they support not just the fossil fuel industry, frankly, but any problematic industry that they might have as their clients, from, you know, the gun industry to private prisons, et cetera. We're focusing on fossil fuels and banks today, and there are three sort of main categories of support that banks give to the fossil fuel industry. So the first one is financing. And what we're talking about when we talk about financing, as we will be for most of today, is when banks provide loans or underwrite bond and share issuances for companies. So loans, pretty straightforward. A bank loans money to a company. That money could be for a very specific purpose to build a particular project, or it could just be for the general needs that the company has. Banks also underwrite bond and share issuances. And what that means is, for instance, if a company wants to, let's say, go public, and it wants to offer ownership, little slices of ownership in its company to the general public, banks actually act as intermediaries, and they first buy up all the shares of that fossil fuel company and then resell them to institutional investors. Similarly, if a company wants to issue a bond, which is essentially like a loan chopped up into little pieces that, again, regular old investors can buy a stake in, the company issues that bond, but the bank first acts as an intermediary, buys up the bond, and then resells it to you and me, or our pension funds, or our university endowments, or what have you. So that's the financing bucket. Banks, and in particular, the big investment banks that we're talking about today, also provide really crucial services for the fossil fuel industry. They help them merge right now, in particular, with sort of all the tumultuousness of the market in the oil and gas world. There's a lot of companies eating each other up or going through bankruptcy. And the banks that we're talking about today play a really key role in facilitating those processes, in advising the fossil fuel companies on how to structure these deals, and making fees off of that process, of course. And then the last bucket I'll mention is investment. And again, if you were on the past webinar and learned about asset management, you learned about how asset managers are part of the climate problem. And banks have asset management arms. And through those businesses, they take all the money that their clients have given them to invest on their behalf, and they invest it all over the place, which of course means some of it ends up invested in fossil fuels. So 3 big buckets. What we're going to focus on today is the financing side of things. And what I want to underscore is how big of a factor this is in the climate crisis. Banks will love to talk about how they are, switching their offices to renewable energy and cutting paper waste at their offices and all of that. That's great, but it doesn't take a lot to imagine that that's not where the bank's real impact lies, and that's therefore not where the big changes need to be made. These banks have enormous footprints on our society, and it's through their financing and their services and investment. It's through their business itself that they are, pressing the gas pedal on the climate crisis, and that's where we need to be stepping in to press the brakes. So we're going to talk a little bit, now that we've set that stage, about how big this problem is and who's involved. So just to say, the data that I'm going to be walking us through, and then Ernst is going to pick up as our next panelist, is from the Banking on Climate Change annual fossil fuel finance report, produced by many of the organizations on this call and endorsed by over 250 organizations from around the world. I'm sure many of whom are on this call, so if that's you, thank you. And I also mentioned that just to say that we all already are part of such a broad-based and interconnected movement, calling banks out for their support for the fossil fuel industry. So thanks for that. So the particular banks that we look at in this work are 35 global banks from the US, Canada, Europe, Japan, and China. These are some of the biggest banks in the world, and really, have their fingers in the fossil fuel pie. So there's a lot of words on this slide, but basically what we wanted to do with this report is answer the question, who is banking the fossil fuel industry? And overall, that means that we look at bank financing for over 2,100 companies across the fossil fuel life cycle, and we see who's banking them. But we wanted to add in some little other ways to look at the data because there's a lot of it. And so in addition, we look at bank financing for 100 top fossil fuel expansion companies in particular. And we also look at financing for particularly problematic sectors of the oil and gas and coal industries. And I want to be clear that all of the fossil fuel industry is problematic, but things like tar sands oil, Arctic oil and gas, fracking, coal power, these are things areas of the fossil fuel world that have gotten a little bit extra attention for maybe their human rights implications or the carbon intensity, or they're just problematic. So we look at top companies in those areas and see who's banking them, so that we can get a better sense of who's the top banker of fracking, of coal mining, etc. And as I said, Ernst will get into that a little later. Here's what we found with that bit of methodology behind us, and thanks for bearing with me. We found that these 35 global banks financed fossil fuels with $2.7 trillion in the 4 years after the Paris Agreement was adopted. That's trillion with a T, which I think for most of us is an unfathomable number, but it's big. That's the key finding there. And the other thing to note that's really worrying is that bank financing, again, from all 35 banks together, has gone up every year in the 4 years since the Paris Agreement. And as you might imagine, that's exactly the wrong direction that we need this graph to be trending in. So we did the poll earlier. As Ben said, many of you, are not new to this fight and have done your homework. And so you know that JP Morgan Chase is the world's worst fossil fuel funder since Paris. And as Ben said, that's by a pretty significant margin, followed by the banks that you see here. What I want to impress upon you with this slide is just how deep these banks are in their involvement in the fossil fuel industry. So, we really have a fight ahead of us. It's already underway, but we are already making progress on it just by calling this out, because banks don't want to talk about their fossil fuel funding. They want to talk about their funding for the renewable energy industry, and they want to talk about all the other nice things that they're doing, charity or what have you. They don't want to talk about this, and so that's what we're here to do, to really call it out. So what do we need from banks? Well, what we envision is a world in which climate change is limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures at most, and in which human rights are respected. Right now, banks don't fit into that world as they're operating. And so we need banks to align with a pathway that's going to get us there. And we see that as meaning that banks need to take 3 steps. The first is to stop funding fossil fuel expansion. And this is based on research that our friends at Oil Change International have done, which shows us that the oil, gas, and coal already in the works brings us up to 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. So we need to stop looking for new reserves, digging up new reserves, building the pipelines, the terminals, the ports that incentivize digging up new reserves. We need to end fossil fuel expansion, and that means we need banks to stop funding it. In addition, we need banks to commit to phase out everything else. Once we've plugged the hole, we still need to drain the tub. And so banks need to phase out their fossil fuel financing overall. And then lastly, this shouldn't have to be said, but it does. Banks need to stop funding projects and companies that abuse human rights, and in particular, Indigenous rights, which are often at stake with fossil fuel development. So that's what we need to see. And hopefully you agree that's what we're all here to fight for. So I'm going to pass it on to the next panelist, but I'll just leave you with a few ways you can get involved from Rainforest Action Network, and we'll revisit these at the end. We have a petition you can sign for against JP Morgan Chase, and we also have a toolkit with really concrete ways that you can do actions and take action on JP Morgan Chase in your community. So with that, I will pass it back.
Great, thank you so much, Allison. And hope folks take note of the ways to get involved on the screen there and get involved to hold JP Morgan Chase and other banks accountable. So we're going to do another quick poll here after what you just learned from Allison. So pretty straightforward. The question is, does it make you mad to know how much banks continue to fund fossil fuels? Option A, yes, I want to fight for change. Option B, no, whatever. So does it make you mad to know how much banks continue to fossil fuels? Pretty straightforward. Just getting a temperature check here. We will close that out in a second. Good, okay. Solid results. Looks like we've got 100% on the yes, I want to fight for change track. So you're all in the right place. And with that, I want to transition to our next presenter. Ernst Jan is from BankTrack, an organization based in the Netherlands. And he's going to talk a little bit more about the findings of the Banking on Climate Change report. So I will hand it over now.
Yeah, thank you. Can everyone hear me? I think so.
Yep.
I can't see my. Okay, cool. I can't see myself, or I can't hear myself, but that's fine. Thanks for this introduction, Ben. So I will take you through the main findings or the key findings of the Banking on Climate Change 2020 report in about 10 slides or so, hopefully also in about 10 minutes. Well, we found, not so surprisingly, that the top 4 fossil fuel banks are all based in the US. Namely, they are JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Citigroup, and 4th on the list is Bank of America. And these 4 banks are responsible for about 1/3 of the fossil fuel financing since signing of the Paris Climate Agreement. So 4 banks out of these 35 are doing almost 1/3 of total financing. And we saw that the biggest increase, at least last year, came from Bank of America, which increased their financing of the fossil fuel industry by about $13 billion US dollars. Now, for Bank of America and Citigroup, they actually increased their financing for fossil fuels last year, while for JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo, it went down slightly, nowhere near enough, by the way, to be aligned with the goals in the Paris Climate Accord. But if you take a somewhat longer time period, so you look from 2016 to 2019, we see that all 4 of these major US banks increased their financing of fossil fuels. And if they continue at this rate, so the average rate between 2016 and 2019, they will hit about an 83% increase by 2030. Compared to 2016 levels, while at the same time, climate scientists are urging us actually to sharply reduce carbon dioxide emissions. So yeah, we are definitely not on the right track in that sense. Next slide, please. Does it work like this? Yeah, cool, thanks. So then, well, we take a step back from the US, then let's look at different countries or continents. In Canada, there are I think there are 3 or 4 Canadian banks in the Banking on Climate Change report, and the biggest fossil fuel financer of those Canadian banks is RBC, Royal Bank of Canada, and they are about 36% larger or bigger in terms of fossil fuel financing than TD, which is the 2nd Canadian fossil fuel bank. In Japan, there's MUFG, the Mitsubishi UFG Financial Group, which is the 6th biggest fossil fuel financer in the world, and they are the largest in Japan by a margin of about 15%. In Europe, it's Barclays, which is the worst one by far, actually, because they are 37% larger than the 2nd biggest one in Europe, which is HSBC. And if we take a look at mainland Europe, BNP Paribas is by far the biggest fossil fuel financer, which is over 50% larger than Société Générale. So then you have an idea about the biggest banks, well, in your continent or country. Next slide, please. Yeah, thanks. So what if we break this down? So this was just for all fossil fuels, financing for all fossil fuels. But what if we break it down, like Allison said, in the more polluting or more destructive subsectors of fossil fuels. Well, that's what we did in the Banking on Climate Change report. So we looked at funding of TARs. Oh, sorry, I'm not there yet. Can you go one slide back? Yeah. So we looked at funding for tar sands, Arctic oil, offshore oil and gas, fracked oil and gas, liquefied natural gas or LNG, and coal mining and coal power. And we looked at the 30-40 companies, biggest companies in each of these subsectors, and how much funding or financing, I should say, they received from these 35 banks that we tracked in the Banking on Climate Change report. Now you can go to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, thanks. So here you see a little matrix, nice and colorful, with on the each column represents one of the subsectors of fossil fuels, and on the left side we added one subsector. Well, strictly speaking, it's not a subsector, but it's funding of fossil fuel expansion, and that is a different category. So this could be expansion of coal mining or fracking gas or offshore oil and gas, but at least it's defined as well, it encompasses all developments of untapped fossil fuel sources and building the infrastructure to bring these fossil fuels to the market. And it's important to understand or to realize that all fossil fuel expansion is incompatible with the goal set in the Paris Climate Agreement. The current fossil fuel projects and infrastructure is enough to push us over 1.5 degrees, and most likely it's enough to push us below over 2 degrees of global warming. So it's simply inexcusable to continue to fund fossil fuel expansion. But what do we see? Well, as Allison said, over the last 4 years, there was about $2.7 trillion in fossil fuel financing, and over a third of this went into the expansion of fossil fuels. And as you see by the color code, the 4 biggest banks in that area were the 4, well, the famous 4, I should almost call them, JP Morgan Chase, Citi, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo. Then we look at the tar sands, which are mainly located in Canada. So not surprisingly, they are mostly funded or financed, I should say, by Canadian banks. Then Arctic oil and gas, offshore oil and gas, fracked oil and gas, and LNG is mostly financed by either US banks or European banks. And then the last 2 subsectors, which are coal mining and coal power, is mainly financed by the biggest Chinese banks. So next slide, please. So yeah, not surprisingly, JP Morgan Chase is not just the biggest fossil fuel financing of like all fossil fuels, but if you look at the subcategories, they're in the top 3 or 4 for each of these subcategories, apart from coal mining and coal power. So JP Morgan Chase is unique among equals, I should almost say. Next slide, please. And here you see again JP Morgan Chase, which funneled more than a $250 billion into fossil fuels over the last 4 years, and they are the biggest fossil fuel financer by a margin of about 36%. Next slide, please. Yeah, so well, this was financing of fossil fuel companies and fossil fuel projects, but the BOCC report also looked at what are actually the policies of these banks. What do they restrict in terms of financing? So we categorized it between coal, which you could earn 80 points for. So if you restrict all coal financing, you get 80 points. And if you restrict all oil and gas financing, you get 120 points, which makes 200 in total. So we see that, well, the French bank Crédit Agricole scored the highest among these 35 banks with about 82 points. Over here, you see, by the way, only the I think there are 21 banks with the highest scores. And you can also see that for coal, the policies are best, or they are most strict, which is mainly caused by the fact that coal is the most polluting one, so most campaigning has been towards coal. Next slide, please. So here you see a little graph of on the horizontal scale, you see the policy score. So yeah, it goes up to about 100 because no bank scored more than 82 points. And on the vertical scale, you see the total fossil fuel financing over the last 4 years. And the color code is based on the country or continent where the bank is situated or is located. And you can clearly see that on the left side, it's mostly Chinese and Canadian banks, which have virtually no policies whatsoever. And the further you move to the right, the stricter the policies become. And generally speaking, the lower the fossil fuel financing. Of course, this is not a one-to-one correlation, but you can see that if a bank implements more and more restrictions on fossil fuel financing, it's gonna finance less fossil fuel companies and projects. So next slide, please. So yeah, due to lack of time, I have to go through this slide quite quickly. But we also looked at 11 case studies in the BOCC report, which are examples of these fossil fuel projects and why they are particularly either polluting or devastating or violating human rights. And I would like to add that at the Banktrack website, banktrack.org, we have a few hundred of these, what we call dodgy deals, or in this case, case studies where you can find all background information you need for your campaign. So if you are campaigning against a local project or pipeline, you can find useful information on our website, banktrack.org. Thank you. Then I'll pass over the microphone to Ben.
Great, thank you so much. We're going to transition now to our next presenter, Dallas Goldtooth from the Indigenous Environmental Network. First, we're going to do one more quick poll here, which should pop up in just a second. So this is a bit more action-oriented. So the question is, what actions do you want to take to hold banks accountable on climate change? Options here: sign petitions, make phone calls, post on social media, move your money, rally at a bank when it's safe, attend a shareholder meeting, all of the above. Or if you have other ideas, tell us in the chat. So again, what actions do you want to take to hold banks accountable on climate change? Please select one of the options or tell us another favorite action in the chat. And we will close that out in just a second here. And all right, looking at the results. All right, signing petitions, moving your money gets a lot of votes. Rallying again when it's safe. I know that many folks here would love to have some more big protests at banks, and I'm sure we'll be back in the streets when we're all able to again. But it's great to see folks interested in a variety of actions here. All right, well, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dallas Goldtooth from the Indigenous Environmental Network. Take it away, Dallas.
Thank you so much, and thank you for everyone for watching. My name is Dallas Goldtooth. I am the Keep It in the Ground campaigner for the Indigenous Environmental Network, and I'm really happy to be here with each and every one of you. I'm here to kind of talk about the Keep It in the Ground fight overall and how we have utilized bank strategies in our work to support Indigenous communities who have been fighting fossil fuel projects for generations now, to be absolutely honest. And to talk a little bit about why we feel, bank divestment, bank strategies are a key part of this struggle to protect Indigenous homelands, to protect Indigenous rights, and to protect life on this planet. So I have a number of slides here kind of showing some of the history and some of the examples of the work around fossil fuel divestment in Indigenous rights. And the first image you see here is an action that was held in Grand Central Station in New York City around the No DAPL protests. So next slide. Okay. So the Keep It in the Ground narrative, this fight, I think a lot of folks in this country, especially those in the climate justice movement, I think can agree that the Keep It in the Ground narrative is relatively young. I mean, it's one that has gained popularity, I would say, in the past, 5 years or more. But the actual fight itself goes back a number of generations, based in Indigenous communities, primarily in the Arctic and in the Amazon forest. And some of the photos that you see here are well over 10 to 15 years old. And these are just demonstrating that the Keep It in the Ground narrative is firmly grounded upon a struggle for Indigenous rights and to protect Indigenous communities. And so this is a photo from our relatives in the Amazon. Next slide. And the Indigenous Environmental Network created the Canadian Indigenous tar sands campaign back in 2010. And a key part of that fight was to help communities in the Canadian tar sands region in northern Alberta, the Dene, Métis, and Cree peoples, fight the expansion of tar sands projects in their homelands. And we identified in that struggle the absolute necessity to go after the financiers of tar sands. And so there was a lot of work back in 2010, 2011 of going after RBS, which is the Royal Bank of Scotland, also HSBC, a number of other banks that are European based. And so we want to highlight this, that divestment is nothing new. It's just, I think has garnered greater interest, and people are really seeing the potential of it. But for a lot of our Indigenous communities, we've always identified that really, it's not just a matter of stopping these projects, it's also a matter of holding the capitalist system accountable for the threats affecting Indigenous communities. I want to also highlight and show that we worked with the UK Tar Sands Network as an organization based in England at that time, who helped pull off these events. And so it really was about collaboration and working with our allies on both sides of the Great Waters to go out to do these things. Next slide. I think next was just a series of just images reinforcing the historical nature of our fight for divestment. Continue, that one's like it's very pixelated, sorry for that one. Go ahead, next. This is another example of a action up in the tar sands. It's a healing walk that was led by folks on the ground there to kind of just for a number of reasons, just to confront the industry itself that's poisoning frontline communities. Next slide. Now, most of us know this fight. A lot of our folks have really jumped onto this moving train of divestment coming out of the fight against Dakota Access Pipeline. The image you see here is a great example of water protectors who were at Standing Rock, which was the largest Indigenous mobilization in recent memory, fighting against this Bakken crude oil pipeline project that was crossing the Missouri River just north of the Standing Rock Reservation. Next slide. In that fight for No DAPL, it definitely went global. It was this movement to protect the sacred, to protect water. And out of that struggle, a lot of us on the ground were just trying to figure out other ways that we could delay construction and really hit the company Energy Transfer Partners where it hurts the most, and that's in their pockets. Go ahead, next slide. I have no idea where I'm at on timeline, so or on my time check.
You're doing
So,
all right.
Thanks,
got
Ben.
at least 5 more minutes.
So for a lot of us who are on the ground in Standing Rock, it was a tough fight. I'm not going to lie. It was very, very tough for those in that frontline space. But it also opened the dialogue about how can allies or other folks, native and non-native, who could not travel to Standing Rock, how can they help in this fight? What can they do? And that born out of that was this defund DAPL movement to really go after the banks. Wells Fargo was one of those main banks that was targeted in that struggle, and we saw massive protests across the country going targeting Wells Fargo to hold them accountable for the violations of Indigenous rights and the violations of Mother Earth herself. Next slide. So this is a number of examples of some of the actions that we're taking, where people really were trying to connect the dots of saying, you know, by us banking in these banks, what are we signing on to? What are we actually, by just having our money in these institutions, what are we signing off as okay, just by supporting them with our own money? And so a lot of folks started divesting their money from out of these banks. Next slide. This is a great example of some of the action work that happened. This is a banner drop that was in the new stadium in Minneapolis during the Vikings. Minnesota Vikings is a brand new stadium. And one of the key banks that was another target during the DAPL fight was US Bank as a main financier of Energy Transfer Partners. And so it was a great way to really put pressure, because the actual stadium itself carries the name US Bank. So that was one of the reasons why that action was very successful, to really highlight the connections between that bank and its investments. Go ahead, next slide. So what did it do? You know, all this momentum, what happened? Well, because of the divestment work by individuals, as well as institutions, as well as municipalities, would cost Dakota Access Pipeline Company and its parent company, Energy Transfer Partners, over $7.5 billion. That's how much the disruption of construction. I'll talk about that divestment itself. These things all hit them in the pockets. Now, Dakota Access Pipeline did get completed, but as many of you may know, the lawsuit was still ongoing that the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe and the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe filed against the government, and they recently got a win where a federal judge has declared that Dakota Access Pipeline has to completely shut down within the next 30 days, which is a tremendous victory. And just the caveat to that is that they have to the Army Corps of Engineers has to complete an environmental impact statement before DAPL could begin operation again, if that EIS gets approved. So it actually has contributed to hitting them in the pockets, but these actions, these movements to divest, I think, created this dialogue about how is the structure of our society, the financial institutions of the society, contributing to the racial inequities in our country? How are they contributing to climate change and climate chaos across the globe? And how are we just endorsing them by just saying, hey, we're going to give you our money? I think it really created this conversation that one of my relatives, Rachel, was going to speak to later on, about what actions can we take to break this systems cycle. Next slide. And I just want to finish this off. This is a picture of my good sister, Bernadette Demetov. She's Gwich'in, from the Gwich'in peoples in northern Alaska, and they have been fighting for decades now to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, the homelands of the sacred calving grounds of the porcupine caribou herd. And in these struggles, I have to emphasize, it's not just a matter of environmental protections that we're fighting for. It's not just a matter of stopping the ecological damage to the land itself. It's also a matter of protecting the indigenous rights of the first peoples of those lands. And that we have shown time after time, we've seen examples that by protecting indigenous rights, by acknowledging and recognizing the original inhabitants of these territories, we are seeing the conservation of biodiversity in those lands. We're seeing the proliferation of a way of life that is regenerative and is not extractive, as we see with the capitalist system. And so they go one and the same, but we always have to emphasize indigenous rights, our human rights, but as indigenous rights protect the land itself. Next slide. So if you want to get other ways to follow along, you can check out Indigenous Environmental Network on Facebook, check out our website. You can learn more about the Gwich'in Steering Committee. Their website is arcticrefuge.org. To learn more about some of the tar sands work and the work that's happening in Canada, you can follow our sister organization, Indigenous Climate Action. They're also on Facebook. And to follow IEN, our organization, you can check out Indigenous Rising Media on Instagram or on Facebook. Also on Twitter, IEN's on Twitter as well. And I think that's it. Is that my last slide? I don't know. Should be. All right, that's it. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Dallas. Thank you so much. We're going to transition now over to Rachel, but got one more poll question here in the meantime that should be popping up any second now. So related to Dallas's presentation about the ways that this work on banks intersects with local fossil fuel fights, we're curious to know which fossil fuel infrastructure fights are you engaged in stopping now? So we have Keystone XL pipeline, the Line 3 pipeline, Trans Mountain pipeline, Line 5, the Jordan Cove LNG terminal, Mountain Valley, perhaps shutting down a coal plant in your area, or other. Tell us in the chat. So curious to see which fights, and maybe the case that more than one. I think you might only be able to pick one option here, but if there's a local fossil fuel fight that you're engaged in that is not represented here, feel free to tell us in the chat. And we will close this out in just a second here. Check out the results. Thank you. It's awesome to see how many people are putting their local fights in the chat here. Looks like we've got most people on Keystone XL, which is great to see, and a good distribution of folks working on other fights is here, and a lot of really inspiring fights being mentioned in the chat here. So that's really great to see. Well, without further ado, I will turn it over to Rachel Heaton from Mazaska Talks, and take it away, Rachel.
Hey, sorry. As soon as it was time to me to start, the screen disappeared. Good morning, everybody. Just a sec before I get started. I just want to introduce myself. And the reason I'm doing this is I would say the momentum for the fossil fuel fight has definitely stepped up since Standing Rock, and in terms of not involvement, but also people paying attention. And Indigenous people have been leading this since then. And so we've made it a point, you know, speaking and when we're at places of introducing who we are, acknowledging that we're on stolen land, that every single person, you know, on here acknowledging, you know, that and where we live, and taking the time to learn the history of the first peoples of where you're at. And so, again, my name is Rachel Heaton. I am a member of the Muckleshoot tribe. I'm a descendant of the Duwamish people. My ancestors are the first people of the lands that we all know as Seattle. And so again, I think it's always important that we learn about where we are. Before I get started on things that Mazasca Talks is involved in regards to ways that we can be involved in line with divestment and with bringing attention to these big banks. But before I start, I want to say Native and Indigenous communities are the first ones that feel the impact of climate change. Our dependency on land, food, water, our culture, and our given right to protect the ecosystems and things, we're the first ones affected by it. And Indigenous and Native people all over the world, which is why a lot of us are on the front lines of this fight. We understand that by design, and I'm speaking of all people, our survival is intricately intertwined with the health of Mother Earth. And this is important when we talk about what these big banks are doing. So just to give a little bit of history of Mazasca Talks, in 2016, when Standing Rock was happening, the works then started because people here in Seattle wanted the ability to be involved, even if they couldn't go over and actually help in the fight. So in 2016, the work to end Seattle's relationship with Wells Fargo started. This was a point where it became apparent that Energy Transfer Partners wasn't going to stop the pipeline. And so at that point, we needed other strategies to be able to fight these fossil fuel companies. And so that's where we found out that Wells Fargo was the largest financer of Dakota Access Pipeline at the time. And we also found out that the relationship with Seattle, that they were banking with Wells Fargo. And so we, at that point, utilized that information to go after the city of Seattle to end that relationship with Wells Fargo because of their involvement in Dakota Access Pipeline, but also because of the funding of all fossil fuel projects and other projects that are desecrating Mother Earth. So fast forwarding to February 2017, camps are getting shut down, but here in Seattle, our campaign to end that relationship with Wells Fargo is won, and the city council passed an ordinance at that time to divest their $3 billion from Wells Fargo. So after this victory, all of those folks that were part of this campaign, we kind of saw that we had something going here in Seattle. So what we did was we rebranded what we were doing here in Seattle with divesting from Wells Fargo, and we went under the new banner of Mazasca Talks and continued this work as an Indigenous-led tool that would provide tools and kits for other cities, universities, businesses, and things where they could divest their own funds. But one of the issues that we ran into when we found that people were divesting their money were like the city of Seattle, where funds were so large, we needed institutions that could hold those funds. And so we found that credit unions did not have the capacity to hold that kind of revenues and money. So what we ended up doing was we started the campaign of public banking. And the intent of the public banking was to give our communities the ability to decide where our money needed to be reinvested. Now, this is years and years of projects that need to be done. However, these conversations, obviously, they have to start now. So last year, there was a victory in California where they passed the Public Banking Act. And so then that would actually allow them to start the process of building their own public bank. And so banks all over the world, Wall Street banks particularly, they support global poverty, mass incarceration of Black and Brown people, the killing and attempted genocide of Native Indigenous people all over the world, the destruction of our water sources, the desecration of Mother Earth. And so we have to move away from these banks because they are not here for our general interest. So what we've had to do, what we have found is the public banking isn't the only solution we need. We also have to take this time to develop relationships with our city council members with our state representatives. And what we've had to do is to use this platform to get into the doors. Not that the relationships are what's moving the work forward, but having the ability to be a part of the creation of policy, the creation of legislation, to do those things. And that's what we really found has made the biggest impact for us with Mazasca Talks, is getting in on that level to be able to create that change versus just being on the front lines. And not that these strategies don't work, it's just that we've had to find other strategies. And so so what we're currently doing with the city of Seattle is, with this divestment work, it's allowed us to use these relationships to now be involved, which now we can move to talking about the Green New Deal. And then by having Indigenous people and those of us doing this sort of work, we are part of that policy making. So when we're sitting at the table, we can talk about where this money goes into our communities versus projects, fossil fuel projects. As we know, Native people, we are affected obviously by the fossil fuel industry beyond what's happening to Mother Earth, but also the man camps and the different things that go up. Our people are affected by those because our women and our children go missing because of these projects that are taking place in our communities without consent. And so here in Seattle, we're using these relationships to bring the intersectional issues of this to the table, but then also to come up with solutions. So with the Green New Deal, what we're finding with COVID is that budget cuts and things are happening. And one of the first places that we're finding that budget cuts and things are happening are with environmental causes, because as we know, police brutality is visible at an all-time high. And so the talk of defunding the police and different things are taking a focus. And so money is being removed in areas such as, like with the Green New Deal here in Seattle, we are continuously at this table because we want to come back and say, instead of funding these banks, instead of funding these projects, let's utilize the funds to create job training programs that equip workers with necessary skills to succeed toward a green economy, but to help ensure transition for workers whose jobs depend on the fossil fuel industry, because those are things that are coming up. You know, people's lives are affected. So, but also utilizing funds to focus on training programs that serve Black, Indigenous, and people of color, including immigrants and refugee communities as well. Again, because these are the individuals that are first affected by climate change, that are created by these big banks financing. For the many people that are involved, again, like I said, building relationships on a state level, a city level, participating in that change, that policy creating. For us, Indigenous voices are generally we're not heard. So that's why we've continued to make sure in these conversations, such as this panel today, that we do have Indigenous voices. You know, we make up 0.8% of the United States population. We make up 4% of the world's population, but we protect 75 to 80% of the world's biodiversity. So this work that we're constantly doing is important, but yet we're invisible. And so I on the screen that's up, those are just different ways that you can get involved with different things that Mazasca Talks is involved in. LastRealIndians.com was started by my other co-founder, Matt Remley. There's different publications that has everything to do with our Indigenous communities, the work that we're all talking about here. It's a great source of kind of what's going on in Indian country in relations to this sort of work and different things that have to do with the violation of Indigenous rights and whatnot. Mazascatalks.org is also a great place to check out if we have events, webinars, things that are coming up, just good information in terms of like what everyone that on this panel has talked about. I'm also a part of 350 Seattle's leadership team. And so we work coincidingly with our campaigns together. And that's been another huge piece, is these relationships with orgs that support one another's work, because as if we figured out, we can't do this alone. We have to come together and we have to do this work. So I just want to close off. My other co-founder, Matt Remley, couldn't be on here, but he wrote an article not that long ago about the importance of divestment, why we're doing it, and just kind of the involvement that we've been a part of. And I just want to close off with his words, and he summed it up best. It says, if you oppose projects like Dakota Access Pipeline, tar sands pipelines, private prisons, immigrant detention centers, Wall Street capitalists, or are in support of movements that are for social, economic, or environmental justice, then ensure that your money, your tribe's money, your city's money, and so on, isn't financing the very issues that you are organizing against. It is counterintuitive to engage in organizing campaigns or litigation on such projects while continuing to have a banking relationship with the very banks financing the projects that you oppose. And so I just want to close off with that it's important to really dig deep and utilize the resources that you've all been provided today to find ways to get involved, whether it's divesting your monies out of these Wall Street banks and for now putting them into a credit union, talking to your communities about what a public bank looks like for you. I know for us, here in Washington State, there's 29 federally recognized tribes. We're looking to communicate with our tribes in creating their own public banks so that we can start putting that power back into our communities and deciding what we want to reinvest in, and us deciding what projects in the direction we should be moving toward. So I think that's all I have for now, and thank you. So.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, I know that we are basically at the top of the hour here. We did want to close out with one last poll, if we can bring that up in just a second here. As those of you who saw the invitation will note that this was part one of a two-part webinar series on banks and climate change. So we learned a lot today, but there's a lot more we can cover and would love to cover with you all. So we want to hear from you about what more we should cover. So the poll question up now says, what should we cover in the next webinar on July 30th? Options include how banks fuel deforestation, one of the other big key drivers of climate change, how local activists are pushing back to not fund fossil fuel projects, how finance campaigning has worked in other countries, how to figure out the bankers and financiers behind the local projects you're fighting, or another, tell us in the chat. So let us know what you would like to see in our next presentation. And as we close that out, we do want to address some of the questions we still have for those of you who are still on. We got a ton of questions, and we were able to address a lot of them in writing. So huge thanks to the team that has been working behind the scenes and answering questions throughout here. Maybe we can bring up the results when we get a second here for the poll. So interesting. We've got pretty even split here among some of the answers, and we'll make note of some of the suggestions in the chat here. But you will see more information soon from Stop the Money Pipeline and the groups here today on the next webinar on July 30th. And we appreciate the feedback there. So in addition to a lot of the questions that we've been working hard to answer behind the scenes, one of the questions we received a lot in different forms was, what are successful examples there have been of bank campaigning on fossil fuel projects? I'll just actually mention, because Dallas brought up our good friend Bernadette Dementov with the Gwich'in Steering Committee in Alaska, has really been leading a fight over the last couple of years to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge from proposed drilling, and has taken that fight directly to banks around the world. And we've seen more than a dozen banks across Europe and Australia change their policies to rule out funding for Arctic drilling. And in just the past few months, 5 of the 6 largest banks in the US, so JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Citi, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, have all ruled out funding for Arctic drilling as well, after hearing directly from Bernadette and the Gwich'in. Actually, Bank of America is the only major US bank that has not yet changed its policy to rule out funding for Arctic drilling. So we have a list of actions here on the screen. I'll just take the liberty of pointing out the third one there is in action. You can go to that link, sc.org/ArcticBofA, and send a message to Bank of America, since they are the last major US bank that has not ruled out funding for Arctic drilling. So stand with the Gwich'in people to protect the Arctic and send a message to Bank of America. But in addition, this is a roundup of all of the links and action opportunities that have been shared throughout here. And I know that a lot of folks have also asked about advice for transitioning bank accounts to better banks. A couple of resources on that. If you go to the Mazaska Talks website, there is a tab under Divest Yourself, which offers some resources for individuals to move their money. And there's a lot of great resources on that page. I know Rainforest Action Network has a set of resources as well. So, but I would definitely start with the Mazaska Talks website, and we can be sure to include that link in a follow-up to this, but check out their website. And maybe while we have last few couple minutes here, I know we're already over time, but if anyone else wants to chime in with any other resources on that question of moving your money, I know a lot of folks have asked about that. And if not, we can be sure to send resources around in a follow-up email. All right, I think given the time, we're already a few minutes over, I think we will have to close it out there. But thank you so much, everyone who joined us. Thank you so much to all of our presenters on this amazing panel today. Please do check out these resources and take action, join this movement. And as we said, part 2 of this webinar series from Stop the Money Pipeline will be on July 30th. So keep an eye out for that. There's already an event made on Facebook. There will be emails coming. So please be sure to RSVP on Facebook and share with your friends. And we will see you all next time. And thank you so much for being a part of this movement. And thank you again to all of our presenters today. Have a good one. Thanks so much.